and welcome to Neurolinguistic Astrology Live. And on today's episode, we are going to be doing essentially a follow-up to my original synastry presentation that I did on JFK and Marilyn Monroe. And in this presentation, I came upon this very interesting finding that JFK, when he was assassinated, so his time of death, there was also two other men who were also died on that same day of the same year, so within 8 hours of each other. We had C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley. And this is quite significant just from a perspective of C.S. Lewis being the creator of Narnia and all of those books, which were actually very dear to my heart when I was a child, as well as Aldous Huxley, who his most known work, of course, is Brave New World. And I read this when I was 16. It really got to me. We're kind of living in a form of Brave New World right now. And so taking a look at these three death charts is going to be quite an interesting time because they all died in 1963. So it's about 60 years since that happened. And this is specifically a death chart reading. And to clarify, we mean time of death reading as opposed to looking at an astrology chart for indicators of when a person may die. So I think that ultimately it's a matter of looking at as everything as having a starseed blueprint. So anything that has an event, so a time or of which you can kind of mark to, has a point by which you can map the entire cosmos by. And by doing that, you can discover really interesting clues behind how this reality functions, as well as how we can get empowerment through our own stories, as well as taking a look at the significance of when an individual actually leaves or transits out of this realm, because that is something that I don't think in our society we do a lot of. We, of course, have a funeral and there's death, but it's not really looked at beyond that, beyond the point of, okay, the time of death is significant as to give us an indication as to the end of this book, the book end of this whole story, and how does this story end, and are there any clues or breadcrumbs for us who are left living out our existence to gain from these stories in terms of these three men who have passed the realm at the same time. So we're going to go into a death chart reading of these three men in the order that they passed. There's also a really interesting book. I haven't read it yet. It's called Between Heaven and Hell, which is an imagined conversation between these three men and what that would kind of look like transiting out and the kind of conversations they would have. So without further ado, let's get into the actual presentation, which I have prepared. All right, so I've taken to this theme of 8-bit and video games, when it comes to presenting this information, just because I do believe, I actually know this, that this life is much like a game, much like a video game. And so if we think about our sole purpose as being the main quest on this journey, we can think of other things. I spoke about this in my podcast, where like sometimes you'll get distractions or other, I can even just call it black magic, or other things that are trying to vie for your attention, that take your attention away from your main purpose, your main soul mission in this existence and in this lifetime. And so from a game perspective, it's knowing certain ultimate universal laws of nature and how this game functions, but also from a perspective of how other players have played the game and if we can learn from it. And so let's get into it. We are going to start with the death chart of C.S. Lewis, because he was the first individual to pass of the three men, and he passed at, I wrote a note of this, in Oxford, England at November 22nd, 1963 at 10:30 a.m. And now remember, time zone situation. This is why also going back to astrology and why your birth time is important, is because all of these luminaries and planets, they all, sorry, you can see my cursor. Yes, okay. So you can see how all of these planets will move based on the for example, the moon will move every 2 hours. And so in some cases, the moon can transit signs if it's going from one sign to another, if it's like at a cusp. But there are certain things between all three charts that are consistent. So we'll take a look at that at the end. I'm going to go through each chart specific to where the ascending or rising sign remaps out the chart, because this is kind of a learning moment for that as well, because the exact time to the minute will dictate the layout of the entire map of the chart. So the housing system and all of that kind of good stuff. Now, as I said before, if you don't know the birth time of a certain thing, you can usually inference it, because that ascending, that arising sign usually has to do with just your first impressions. I like to look at it from a video game perspective. When you are first picking a character, you're going to pick, am I going to be a ranger? Am I going to be an elf? Am I going to be an assassin? That kind of thing. So it's like kind of like this surface level role of what you're going to play the game as. And then all the other planets give some depth and flavor and intensity and context to what that initial kind of impression is. No different when you meet someone first. And so in this case with C.S. Lewis, it puts the ascendant, so where like the chart is going to start, in Capricorn. All these other things, the moon will pretty much stay the same. A really big interesting thing to note about the time of death of these three men, and also the fact that JFK was assassinated at this time, is that this all occurred on the last degree of Scorpio. So the 29th degree of Scorpio, just before it becomes Sagittarius. And this is significant just because that's a transitory period, and Sagittarius and Gemini, the opposing sign to Sagittarius, are known as gates in a sense. They're known as gates by which souls transition in and out of this realm metaphysically. And so if we think about this significantly by the fact that all three of these men's deaths, their transition happened at the end of Scorpio, and Scorpio also rules the underworld before you come into like a state of knowing, that is significant. So the main things that you'll see in the other two charts, how the rising sign will adjust the placement of what the chart will look like. But let's see here. Main things to kind of note in terms of aspects, right? Because we are always, the aspects are the angels and the angels are the angles, and they act as guidance to give us clues as to what perhaps is going on. And so regardless of the ascendant or rising sign, you can see that there are all these planets happening here between Sagittarius and Scorpio. And this is very much if you think of the zodiac as being sliced in half, and you have more of like these personal planets. So like Aries is the self, and Taurus is the body, and Gemini is communication. These are all very personal things. When you get past Libra, when Libra splits the zodiac, you start to get into much more subconscious and overall collective themes. And so when you think about Scorpio, Libra is like the split between worlds. And so you're coming now into the underworld of Scorpio. And so it's significant, like as we're coming down here, it's almost as if these three men dying at the same time created an energy signature for this specific time space. Because if you see here, like there's also Mercury, Mars and Venus are very, very tight here in Sagittarius as well. So there's a lot of energy to support the sun as it's making its transition out of the underworld, which is interesting because, you know, you think about all of them dying at that same time. It's like, aren't you now going into the underworld? But if we think about the story that they leave us, perhaps it's a matter of, it's just the end of this age and we are now embarking on something new, which is kind of similar to the time that we're dealing with right now, because it is 60 years. So 2023, this happened in 1963. It's 60 years since this has happened. We're a little past, of course. Actually, we're not there yet, because it happened in November, so November of this year will probably be a very spicy, hectic time. Okay, so other things to notice in this particular death chart, we're not gonna spend too much time here because remember, they all died on the same day, so the main differential point will be the ascending rising sign. So we'll move on into JFK's chart. We may come back and revisit this if we talk about very specific things. Remember, this is live, so. All right, so JFK. Just make sure I'm not blocking the chart so you can see. All right, so JFK passed in Dallas, Texas at 12:30 p.m., which I find interesting as well. Or rather, he was shot at 12:30 p.m. I think that they announced him as being dead when they brought him into the hospital afterwards, but the time of death that I'm running this chart with is at 12:30. So about an hour, remember, in a different time zone too than C.S. Lewis, but it did occur afterwards in time space. So as you can see here, that rejigs the chart slightly. And we do still have the sun cusping between Scorpio and Sagittarius, moving into that. Let me just, Neptune is in Scorpio at that time too. Let me just double check. Is that? It sure is, yeah. Neptune is in Scorpio. That's interesting. So I'm always interested in Neptune just because, also, if you can see here, it's aspecting with the North Node, and the North Node is a lunar node of destiny. And so a level of the dreams, this particular event is going to influence people's dream space, which it did. It was a fall of Camelot. They referred to this time period in American history as Camelot, and I love the symbology of Camelot because I love King Arthur and all the Arthurian legends. And the end of Camelot actually happened with the quest for the Holy Grail. And this is a nice segue into how life is like a video game and the danger of bullshit side quests. So the Holy Grail was a quest that Arthur and many of the knights probably never should have gone on, because that quest was really for Galahad, which was Sir Lancelot's son, who was known as the perfect knight. The Holy Grail could only be discovered by the perfect knight. And the perfect knight is not just, physical prowess or anything like that. It was considered that you had to have virtue and strength, and there's like this code from the Knights Templar from back in the day when knighthood was starting to become a thing, that this idea of chivalry, and that's part of being a perfect knight. And Lancelot would never get it just because he was sleeping with Guinevere, and Arthur would never get it because he slept with his half-sister. There's a bunch of other things that probably they could have done instead of the Holy Grail to fulfill a soul purpose. And that's also just recognition in itself, to know like what quests are yours to fulfill and what quests are probably like they might be a waste of time. You may learn a lot of stuff from it, but then it just might mean that like you have to come back and do some other stuff to learn things. But my opinion on the Holy Grail is that Camelot never would have fallen if Arthur was there to man the castle and didn't have all of this stuff happen, drama, and then them trying to burn Guinevere at the stake for adultery. So he could have done something about it, perhaps. Okay, so let's go back to JFK's chart. The main things that change here are, of course, the rising sign. And so this puts it in Aquarius, which is interesting. The moon and Saturn are in Aquarius together. So we have a moon-Saturn conjunction, not super tight conjunction, but in Aquarius. That's significant, that because all three of those men share that. The moon ruling the inner emotional world, and Saturn being a planet of karma and time and change. And so all of our inner worlds were shifted as a result of this event. And then having the ascendant sitting here as well, I would say that this is an indicator that JFK's death is the crux by which whatever this was, this main transition point, this main plot device in the story happened, just because that rising sign is like the indicator of like that's the exact time it happened, and at the exact time he had in Saturn was right there, kind of like this was always going to happen. Just crazy to kind of think about it, look at it right now like that. Other things here are the fact that Pisces, and this is Uranus, I always get them confused, but Chiron is the key with the K at the top, and that's in Pisces, which is in the dream world. And so like the idea of a lot of healing probably from a collective level will occur as a result of this. Having this opposed Uranus is also the idea of like a wild card, having something that's never ever happened before, and that's very much the case as it comes to this chart as well. Yes, so other things remain standard, and so that JFK's death was the one that happened in the middle. We had C.S. Lewis happen first. I believe it was a heart attack or some sort of heart thing. He passed, and then we had JFK, and then a few hours later we had Aldous Huxley pass. And now Aldous Huxley was a unique one because he of course did write Brave New World, but he also wrote a book called Doors of Perception, and he was a big fan of LSD. He actually passed with his wife administering LSD intravenously into him as he passed. So that's significant as well. He's the last one of this triad to leave the realm, and probably the one who had the most awareness of what this reality was kind of doing. I think C.S. Lewis did as well in a mystical kind of way, and Aldous Huxley was in a more practical kind of way, just different ways of creating worlds for us. And I mean, I had a psychedelic experience where I had a consultation with these two because I found out about their deaths when I was doing a different astrology research project on a synastry between JFK and Marilyn Monroe, and this came up, and I was like, how come more people don't talk about this, the fact that they all died at the same time? There's got to be something there. There's a clue there. There's a breadcrumb there left for us to kind of unravel and look at. So I'm hoping by doing this presentation for you guys as well that you guys can take this as well and take a look at the angle. So like this one, Aldous Huxley, if you can already see here, there's a grand cross that is formed due to his ascendant or his time of death happening in Gemini. So that's significant. We now have this opposition between the ascending sign and Mercury as well in Sagittarius. And remember, I mentioned in the beginning that these gates where you come in and out of this incarnation are in Gemini and in Sagittarius. And so having the ascendant there too, Aldous Huxley, it's like, did you plan it? Did you always know? But regardless, we do have some of these same aspects remain the same, even though they're in different houses. But I'm not going to necessarily talk about that. See, this opposition here is still the same, just in different houses. But the main thing here, we'll talk about the ascendant aspect, just because that will be the one unique to Huxley's death chart. So this Grand Cross is between Gemini and Sagittarius. So you have, if you're born natally with this aspect, it's actually quite challenging because you can feel there are multiple massive energies pulling against you, and it can be hard to feel like any decision that you make is the right one because you have something in you telling you that it might not be. And so you can tend to second guess yourself a lot when it comes to trying to find a way forward. So that can be challenging. However, in terms of a death chart, in terms of a transition, we have to look at this as like, what clues is this leaving behind for us as they move on to the next adventure? And Aldous Huxley basically left us with this Grand Cross with the ascendant and Mercury rules thought, communication, writing, all of that kind of stuff. Very fitting. And then here, the same thing that I was talking about in JFK is the whole idea that Chiron was in Pisces, as well as we have Uranus. And of course, how could I forget about Pluto? Good old Pluto, wrecking havoc, burning down towers, all that kind of fun stuff wherever we go. So I would say it's also Chiron is also opposing these two. So Pisces and Virgo are also opposites. So you have these ideas of coming to form, and then a much more imagined spirit world as well. So I think there's a level here of an understanding that Huxley knows that his death, like this transition time, will leave a message about the nature of what is going on here, and like the works that he left behind, because Mercury is communication and Sagittarius is I shouldn't say that it's like a higher octave, but it's more like, if you think about education with Mercury, you could think of Sagittarius as like universities, so, and libraries. So the institutions and the greater concepts behind things like reading, writing, and communication. And so having those like oppose each other with Mercury in the mix, and the idea of like, I chose a certain character when I came into this life and to live out this existence, and whereas of, okay, I am no longer going to be an author in creative world, I'm going to go into the next world. Kind of like what Dr. Manhattan said, I'm going to go off and build my own other universes elsewhere. This one, I've done what I was supposed to do here, and now it's on to the next. So that's kind of how I kind of picture that as being with Aldous, like for us to look at it as a clue into how our perception of this world functions. All right, so I'm gonna get into more of the clues behind the veil as to why you would even want to do a death chart. Why does it matter leaving this realm? I think that we don't do a very good job of acknowledging it and realizing that we are in synastry, especially like, that's why I even came upon this intel, was when I did a synastry with JFK and Marilyn, and they were both Geminis, and what that connection would have been between the two. And in seeing that, you can just see that at that time, it was the 60s, right? A very new, novel time, and this death of JFK, along with two world builders, the man who created Narnia and Aslan and all of those fantastical imaginary but very powerful archetypes and themes that get to live on in a storybook that transcends. And then we also have Aldous Huxley, who also has created worlds, but there's also like it's less inspiring and more of like a call to like warning. It's a warning, which I don't think we heeded very well, but I even talk about the fact that Aldous Huxley talks about Soma in his Brave New World book, but it's an acronym, SOMA, Soma. It's their drug, it's their SSRI. I look at that, Soma, as SSRI, and then the idea of also even microdosing and all of that being lumped into the same idea of this very corporatized way of just functioning in the construct, as opposed to living out what your truest existence is supposed to be. And I think that's the main clue that we get behind this. 60 years later, we had three greats die at the same time. All we could pay attention to was the fact that JFK was shot and they killed the president. But you had Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis, they didn't like know it. It was a very ill-attended funeral. And of course, you had this great big event happen that distracted everyone. But I think that because of that, we didn't take a look at the other two who had left, and we don't see the fuller picture of what that story tells as a whole, and the fact that storytelling is how this world functions, and where our attention goes is very important. And as I said, they all met their time of death on the last degree of Scorpio, as it's transitioning, moving into the next stage of whatever this incarnation will hold for you. And it's a time of intense change and transformation. And Chiron there, a lot of those opposition forces between, things that have been built and then things crashing down and changing into a new form of what that is. Because yeah, it's a cycle of time. You can come back to the same time of summer each time, but it's going to be a different summer, but other things are going to be the same. So it's an acknowledgement of that change and transformation between those three. Okay, so, and keys to the game of life. And this is just a little bit more of, I guess, driving the point home that astrology is more of an observation. It's not trying to predict anything, although you could use it to some degree to forecast certain things and events because of the cycles of time, right? But not from a perspective of like knowing exactly when to the date and minute that you're going to die or pass this realm, or who you're going to fall in love with. There's always very many possibilities, and probably, how I would put it, as very many different paths that you could take your story in this particular lifetime. But there are going to be ones that are meant for you to do. Just like I was saying with the Holy Grail situation, that if those who truly felt called to the Holy Grail went, and the others were like, your actual calling is to defend Camelot and keep that golden age, and like defenders and others who choose to usurp it, then maybe it wouldn't have fallen and didn't get distracted by trying to play a role that is not for you to play this time. You will get to be Galahad one time. We all get to play that role. It's just you have to realize where you are now and live that life out to your best ability, because right now we need everyone to be doing that and not have everyone playing a certain role that is dictated to us. You have to go inward, find what the key is to you fulfilling your soul purpose, and like go at it from that point. Okay, so that takes care of this presentation. I've been meaning to do this topic for a while, actually more than a year ago. It's been a little while now of me practicing astrology, and so this is just something I think I would like to leave as a learning tool for you Starseeds, to realize that it's about recognition. It's not, I love belief, but belief in yourself, belief in what you're capable of, belief in that kind of things. But I practice discernment, use the clues and the tools and the breadcrumbs that are left to us from those who came before us, the greats who came before us, the stories they left behind. All of this kind of stuff is all meant to help us take the story further to its next stage. And I hope that this presentation helps you to find your own keys to life, to figure things out. And oh my gosh, my phone is ringing. It's funny. That's a good place to end. Okay, Starseeds, I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, lunchtime, middle of the night if you're watching it at that time, wherever you are in the cosmos. And I will catch all of you next time on Neurolinguistic Astrology Live.